Good evening, good evening. I'm Russ Linden. I'm with Welcoming Greater Charlottesville. We're co-sponsoring this event with the center. It's a wonderful place. I was just talking with my colleague about it. Those of you who have been around know what a really jewel it is for the community. So we really appreciate their space and their support. This is the second of a two-part series on migration. Last week we had David LeBlanc, the UVA professor who teaches and has written extensively about migration issues worldwide. That was kind of the big picture from 30,000 feet or 60,000 feet. We learned a lot from David. And tonight we have a different expert, Alyson Ball, who with her husband lives at least 4 or 5 months of the year in southern Arizona, goes to the border, knows a tremendous amount. And the topic tonight is what's the situation at the southern border. That's not the exact title, but that's the gist of it. I want to explain that we have two experts. Alyson is one who's going to be our speaker. Amanda Frost is going to be our moderator, so she's going to introduce Alyson. She's going to ask some questions, and then she's going to field your questions and let Alyson respond. Real briefly, Amanda writes and teaches in fields of immigration and citizenship law, federal courts, jurisdiction, and judicial ethics. She has testified before the Senate and House Judiciary Committees. Her non-academic writing has been published in The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and many others. Amanda is the author of the book You Are Not American, an interesting title, Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers. You have to say a little bit about what this intriguing title is.
So delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Alyson Ball, and Alyson comes to us with a great deal of experience with the southern border, both from her visits and from her study of the immigration issues there. She earned an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from Cornell University. And after a career in corporate marketing and international strategy, she worked in microfinance as a troubleshooter in Africa and Central Asia. She's currently volunteering as a member of the Community Development Committee of the IRC, which resettles refugees in Central Virginia. And as Russ also suggested, she, for the last 7 years, has spent winters in southern Arizona, where she has studied U.S. immigration, so she can inform the public, us, about U.S. immigration issues. And the title of tonight's event is What's Really Happening at the U.S.-Mexican Border. And as the description suggests, this is an issue that is, of course, pressing for many reasons, including that it is a major issue in our elections. And as I tell my immigration students, while I don't always love the rhetoric around immigration, I actually think it's very appropriate that this is a highly salient political issue and one we should all be educated about. So I'm looking forward to learning from you tonight.
Thank you, Amanda. And thanks, Russ, for having me, and for the center for having me as well. I'm very excited to be here. I'm excited to see so many familiar faces in the audience and some folks that I saw from last week's session, and also some new faces. Hopefully you've read through some of these key points, so I won't go over those, but I would like to start just by asking you, what are some of the topics that you wonder about? What were some of the things that you thought, I hope she talks about this issue? Were there some specific things? Yes. The reason that we have an open border. Okay, we'll talk about open borders for sure. What else? Yes. Providing for housing and jobs for people who are here who want to work. Good. Yes. Yes, good. Distinguishing between asylum seekers and economic migrants. What else? Yes. Yes, what's happening with families and young children. Hold that question, because it's not something that I talk about, but we can as part of the question and answer. Good. Yes. 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 Housing by the border and housing in places like New York City we're reading about now. Who's paying for all this housing? Where's the money come from? Good. We'll talk about all these issues. Yes. Should all of the states be willing to take the should there be a plan? Good question. You might be here doing the lecture next week when we look for solutions. Good. Anything else? Just last week we talked about TPS a lot. I remember you had a question about TPS, temporary protected status. We'll talk about that again this week, just so you can see where it fits in the picture. I have about 20 slides here, and I'll probably talk for about 50 minutes. So that's why it's very important that you can see the slides. And what we're going to start with, because I think it's very important, and it's that really that very first point. The border is a part of our national landscape. So we need to understand the laws that organize us around immigration before we can think about what's going on at the border. So right in the beginning, I'm going to give you an overview of the border. Here are my topics. We're going to take a quick look at the border. We're going to look at U.S. legal immigration, which is the overview of how does our country treat immigrants. Then we're going to talk about who's migrating. We talked about this a little bit last week. And then we're going to talk about the recent policies and their effects at the border. We're going to talk a little bit about the Mexican cartels, a little bit about the border wall, and then we'll open it up for questions. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, so I hope you'll help me out by just holding your questions until the end. We have just too big a group to have people stop me with their questions during the presentation, but I'd love to hear your questions at the end. So here we go. This is just a reminder of what the border looks like. This is really a border patrol map that talks about the different sectors of the border from the border patrol standpoint. But as you remember, it's California on the far left or west, Arizona. This is where we go to Arizona, right here halfway between Tucson and Nogales. So a little community called Green Valley. That's where we spend our winters. New Mexico and Texas. It's about just a little under 2,000 miles, this border. I'd just like to remind people that there's a lot going on at the border, more than what you're seeing in the pictures. There's a lot of commerce going on. There's a lot of culture going on. And so this just shows you the daily legal crossings at the border. This is for across the whole border. We see over almost 175,000 cars every day, personal vehicles. We see pedestrians crossing. We see trucks crossing. And we see many trains crossing this border. So keep in mind that Mexico is our second partner for both exports and imports. They're very important to us, and there's a lot of trade going back and forth across the border. Where we are in Nogales, we see lots of vegetables. Something like half of the winter vegetables that we eat in the United States come from Mexico. So while you only see pictures of people who are crossing the border who are seeking asylum, this is a very important trade partner to us, and it's a very important relationship that the United States has with Mexico. Now I've got 3 slides talking about what are our current immigration laws, and this is a very complicated slide, or it's got a lot of words on it. It's important to remember that the laws that we are following now in the United States mostly come from a law that was passed in 1965, and that's what we're going to talk about on this page. On this page, this is a big, thick law, like 1,000 pages, and there are something like 186 different visas that are designated in that law from 1965. We're still living with it today. And what this does is it tells us how are we going to bring people to the States, how are they going to become our citizens. So what this law says is there are really 4 main ways that people can come to the United States and become citizens. They can come on family visas, they can come on professional or work visas, they can come on diversity visas, or they can come on humanitarian visas. So everything we're going to talk about on this page has to do with people who are vetted overseas. They come with a specific visa. They stay here for a year or 2. They then can convert that to a green card down the road. And then after about 5 years, they can become citizens if they so choose. Now we have problems with this law, and I'm going to tell you some of the problems with the law. in a typical year, we would see about 1 million people coming into the country with these visas. A typical year, that would be before, say before COVID. So we have a lot of people coming into our country legally on these visas. Family visas are tiered, and they would come in from different places, different countries. They might be spouses, they might be children, they might be parents of existing citizens or people with green cards. So we have different settings, but these visas are limited based on the country of origin. So let me tell you what that means. So let's say I was an American citizen, but I wanted my sister to come live here. In the past, I'd come from, let's say, Iceland, but I'd come here on a student visa, and then I got a work visa, and then I was able to convert that into a citizenship for myself. And I wanted my sister from Iceland to come. There aren't a lot of people who want to come from Iceland, so that's not really a problem. But if I were Mexican, there are so many people who want visas for their Mexican sisters, there aren't enough to go around. So the line to wait for a visa for that is very, very long. Or if I were from the Philippines, a long line waiting, lots of people waiting so they can't get in here. So that's one of the problems with this law, that we have this country of origin restriction for each of the visa categories. It was encoded in the law, and we can't change it unless we change the law. Now notice how many professional work visas there are, only 140,000. We'll come back to the work visas in a minute. Diversity visas is a small category, and basically we decided we don't have enough diversity for people coming in, so we started this not until 1990. We sort of tucked that into the law and added that in. Now the humanitarian visas are where it starts to get interesting. There are 3 main categories of humanitarian visas. The first is the special immigrant visa. This is for people who have worked with our either military or our government overseas in only Iraq and Afghanistan. And we've said if these people have worked with us while we were at war in those countries, they would be at risk if we left that country and they were to stay there. So they have a right to apply for a special immigrant visa. Again, just 2 countries. Now, about 2 years ago, you may remember seeing on the news the people leaving Kabul, the people from Afghanistan, trying to leave as we did. Unfortunately, this is where we wanted to put the Afghanistan people from Afghanistan, but there was one problem. The minute they got on the plane to leave, they were no longer qualified for this kind of visa. So that was a big disappointment for us and for them. On the next page, we'll see what we ended up doing with all those people and why there's such problems with the Afghanis who are here today. So again, all these people on this page are getting pathways to citizenship. Now, refugees, the US president every October, and he's just made his declaration for this coming year, decides how many refugees we will take into the country or what the goal will be for the coming year. Now, these are people who are either living in refugee camps around the world, or they're people who are living on the economy. But they've been designated by the United Nations as being refugees. President Biden just declared for next year, we will be having a goal of 125,000 refugees. Here in Charlottesville, I work with the IRC, which is the International Rescue Committee, and we're in our 25th year of settling refugees here, and we've resettled over 5,000 refugees here in Charlottesville through that system. So, okay, every group from here on up, again, all these people are vetted overseas. All these people, they're looked at medically, they're looked at for any past crimes, they're looked at for what's their family relationships, and they apply from overseas. They're accepted and then they come into the country. The one exception is this asylum seeker. And this is one of the problems we currently have at the border is this is how people are coming into the country. So what's the proof for these last two? For both the refugee and the asylum seeker, it's a very strict and it's a very narrow rule. And it's coded in our laws, and it's also included in the treaties that we've signed internationally. It says you can only qualify to be a refugee or to be an asylum seeker if you have been persecuted based on one of 5 things, and they're written here: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. That's the only way you can be a refugee or an asylum seeker, is if you prove that you are persecuted based on one of those reasons. It doesn't say if you're poor and need money. It doesn't say if you have domestic violence. It doesn't say that if you're afraid of the gangs. It doesn't say if you can't trust the police. It only says if you can prove that you've been persecuted for one of these 5 reasons. The other important factor here that I just want you to be aware of are some of the other promises that we make about asylum seekers or refugees. What we say about asylum seekers is we will take asylum seekers from anywhere, we will not put them in prison, and we will not return them into harm's way. What does that mean? It says, let's say you come here on a student visa and you're at the university, in Iowa. You can, from that place in Iowa, seek asylum when you're standing there as a student on a student visa. It says if you are standing at the port of entry in New York, you fly into New York and you decide you want to ask for asylum, the minute you arrive, you can seek asylum. You're standing on our soil. At the southern border, if you come to the port of entry and you seek asylum, then you are standing on our soil and you can ask for asylum from there. So this is from anywhere. And right now at the southern border, people are asking for asylum by crossing the border, not at the port of entry, but between the ports of entry. This is a very controversial issue about what's happening at the border right now, is where are these people crossing the border? The law says we will take the asylum request from anywhere, which includes if we cross the border between the ports of entry, you're standing on our soil, you can seek asylum. We'll take your request at that point. We will not put you in prison or detention. That's controversial also because that is happening at the southern border. And we will not return you into harm's way. There have been at times where we have returned people who have sought asylum in the US. We've returned them to Mexico. And the northern Mexico border is quite dangerous for people who are vulnerable, who are poor, and who are living on maybe the street or in shelters. So anyway, we're going to talk about this more, but just keep in mind, again, we're talking about this one law. This is all the legal ways people can enter the country. This is what our law says. It's a number of visas, but it's what exists in our law today. Now on the next page, we're going to talk about ways to come to the country, but not pathways to citizenship. Now again, back to that main law, that 1,000-page law, we have about 100 visa categories for people who could come here temporarily, and what I'm calling workarounds. Now, that's my term, workarounds. What are the things we've done because our law seems to be inadequate and we need to make some changes from what we have? Again, you're probably familiar with this. We give a lot of people travel visas to come here and business visas to come to work. We allow people to come here to study or to have student exchanges. We have special work visas. Now, these are just temporary work visas. You may have heard of the H-1B, which is the technical computer person or the medical person who comes here and who has a job in a technical field. H-2A is an agricultural, temporary, seasonal agricultural worker. H-2B is a specialty worker, people who work in oyster fields or who work in vineyards. Those would be specialty workers, not agricultural workers, but specialty workers. Not too many of those coming in here. Notice these numbers. You may have heard about DACA. Now, this was not part of that original law, but this was an executive order in 2012 by President Obama, who said, I'd like to help those people who came in as children of folks who came here without the proper authorization, but these children grew up here. This DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So again, this is what I'm calling a workaround. It's not in the original law, but what Obama said was, I'm going to give you permission to live here and work here and get your license here, even though you were brought here as a child and you don't have the proper papers. You still, again, it's on this page, no pathway to citizenship, and I'll give you a temporary reprieve for 2 years, at which time you can then reapply for the DACA status. So that's one workaround. The next workaround I'm going to talk about is this humanitarian parole. Generally, okay, this was in the original law, but this was generally used for people who were ill and needed to come here for specific medical problems that they had. And it's been used a lot now recently because we've started to use it in the last few years for large numbers of people. Remember I said, where did those Afghans go? The people from Afghanistan. Some of them came here into humanitarian parole. How could we get them into the country quickly? We used the humanitarian parole for some of those folks. We used it for the people from Ukraine. We're now using it for people from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti. So we're starting to use this mechanism that was part of the original law more often than not. Now, interestingly, these two, DACA and humanitarian parole, are being argued in the courts as we speak. The DACA question, whether it's legal or not, is going to the Supreme Court, and you should hear more about that either later this year or early next year. The question is, did Obama have the right to create that system, and will it continue? So you can imagine how the people feel with this status. They're not sure what's going to happen to their lives. Same with humanitarian parole. It's hard for us to explain to somebody from Afghanistan who maybe put their life on the line why it is that they don't have a pathway to citizenship. How come they're not on page 1, the previous page, but they're here, they're in this temporary status. Now we've started to use another mechanism that also was not part of the original law, but was added in 1990, and that's called temporary protected status. What does temporary protected status? It says if you are already in the country and you're from certain countries and you've come by a certain date, you will be allowed to stay here temporarily. So this is become a catch-all for some of these other categories where there's a legal limit, and after a certain time it's going to expire. So I'm going to show you on the next page all the countries for which we have created temporary protected status. So again, if you have a country where people are already in the US and at home they have an armed conflict or an environmental disaster or an extraordinary circumstance where they cannot return, we have created a status for some of those people. So we have about 700,000 or 800,000 people who are eligible from one of these countries so that they can be tucked under this temporary protected status. These are the dates when the status will expire. So again, as we drive up to those dates, the government has to decide to continue and to extend that capability. So now I probably confused you totally. Just remember, we have temporary status, and some people have no pathways to citizenship, and sometimes they drive up to a cliff and they fall off and they have no protection. That's what we've created, a whole series of issues where there's a lot of insecurity for some of these people who are here. Let's turn to a little bit a little easier topic to understand. Who's coming here and why? For those of you who came here last week, you heard David talking about why do people migrate? And we have the same reasons people are coming to the U.S. that we see migrants all over the world. There are economic issues, conflicts or wars, there's political problems, and there's corruption all over the world. We've got an interesting situation there. We have really evolved over time, and you'll see this in the numbers that I'm going to show you in a minute. But we think about the 1990s, the 80s, and the 90s, when really we saw a lot of Mexican men coming to work. That was where our first people who used to come here more often than not. And then we started to morph from the Mexicans, but also we included Central Americans and then Central American families. And now you'll see families from all over the world coming to the southern border. And when I show you the numbers, I'll start to explain why. When we start talking about the border and what we've done at the border, you'll see why some of these people were incented to come to the southern border. I also wanted to make it a point, when the media claims that the U.S. has open borders, that just encourages the migrants. We hear people say when we talk to them, why did you come? And some of them say, I heard you had open borders. Well, we don't have open borders. We don't, but this is what we say on the media, and they do hear the media overseas, so we're encouraging people to come with this rhetoric. And also we have local smugglers all over that really make it easy to make the trip. This is a notice on a board that is up in the highlands of Guatemala, where sometimes I go visit. And what it says is, we offer trips to the United States, and you can pay when you arrive at your destination. Makes it very easy. Here's my phone number. Just call me. Now, this is illegal in Guatemala, but it's right there on the board right out, and people know who the people are who are the smugglers. They know where to go. They know the fact that that they want to go north. It's very easy to do that. Let's take a look at this chart. This looks at time along the bottom. It starts at 2008 and it goes to 2022. The black lines are Mexico, so you can see the Mexican numbers sort of going down and coming up here at the end. The gray is Northern Triangle countries, 3 countries only, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So just right south of Mexico, the next 3 countries are those 3. So that's the gray. And again, you can see it starts low and it really moves up, and then it gets quite high here. This is Guatemala, 2019. There was a lot of weather problems. So it drove a lot of migration in 2019. And then these numbers, I'll talk more about 2020, 21, and 22 when we talk about the border. This is the COVID era and what happened. But then all other countries, to me, is the most interesting, the little pink line. You don't see other countries, but then eventually they get more and more. And then look at this last year, 2022. I'm talking about people from China, from Russia, from Turkey, from all over, of course, South America, the rest of Central America, but Ukraine, people coming from the Ukraine to the southern border. So lots of people coming from lots of countries in this latter era. Just remember these large numbers here. 2020, not so much because this is when COVID hit, but then the next year and then the next year, we had some policies that, in my opinion, incented people to come here. And then here it is. Title 42 is a health-related restriction. And in March of 2020, you may remember when COVID hit, we also designated that people could not come to the southern border. This was a CDC rule that was implemented, as sort of a little known rule. What we basically said was, although in the past you could always go to the port of entry and apply for asylum, we would no longer take asylum requests at the southern border. None, from no one from any country. That was what we said with this rule. And we would expel Mexicans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, and El Salvadors. In other words, if they came across between the ports of entry, we would turn them right back. We would put them right back across the border and leave them there. Now, unfortunately, this rule broke several of the laws that we know to be in existence. Number one, remember I said that we had a law that said asylum requests are taken from anywhere. So we were basically shutting off the avenue that we had for people to ask for asylum at the southern border. We were not allowing asylum seekers to come there. Also, we said we would not return people back into harm. So Mexicans who came seeking asylum and crossed the border during this time were sent right back. They were sent right back into harm's way. There might be cartels there that were following them. There's a lot of problems along the northern part of Mexico just because there are a lot of people who are poor and who are seeking asylum. So it's not a very safe place for people to be. I think this is the one that had the biggest impact. Border crossers are generally charged with a federal crime if they cross between the ports of entry. If you or I were to cross the border, not at the Nogales port of entry, but between that and, say, Yuma, the next town over, if you or I were to cross between the ports of entry, it would be a federal crime. What we said with this law was, we're not going to charge that crime. All these people who were entering between the ports of entry were not charged with a crime, but were expelled right back. Guess what the cartels were telling these people? They were saying, hey, this is the time to come because there's no penalty. There is absolutely no consequence for you to cross between the port of entry and try to get into the United States, because if they find you, they're just going to expel you. They're not going to charge you with a crime like they normally would. They're not going to throw you in jail or detention like they normally would. They're just going to return you across the border. And so that's one of the reasons why those numbers start to shoot up. We know that people cross multiple times to try to get into the country. I think it worked to our disadvantage. When Biden came into office, it was a huge debate whether he should try to shut that Title 42 down right away or to wait. He waited, and what that did was it basically incented more people to come because they started to hear, hey, this policy might go away, and if you're going to go now, because if the policy goes away, there are going to be big penalties if you cross and you get caught. So I think, unfortunately, what was intended was that this was going to keep people out. It didn't necessarily keep people out, but it incented people to try more and more to cross the border. And when people say that we have open borders, what they're referring to, I think, is the fact that we had this COVID restriction where we didn't take any asylum requests at the port of entry, and now we're going back to the law. We're actually doing what's legal and what our laws say we should do by accepting asylum at the borders, and that's why they're criticizing Biden for having what he calls open borders. They're not open, but yes, we're accepting asylum seekers because according to law, that's what we should be doing. So what did Biden do after he eliminated Title 42? Yes. Okay, good question. John says, why don't you tell people about the process to apply for asylum? Let's go through that. Let's take an example. Maria and Pedro are living in El Salvador. She's the mother, and he's about 8 years old. and they decide that they want to seek asylum. I don't really know the reason, but they've decided they're going to seek asylum. They're going to probably pay someone to help them get up to the northern part of Mexico. They're going to have to pay a smuggler to do that, or they could go on their own, a very dangerous trip for a mother and their young child, but it's done all the time. So they pay to get to northern Mexico. This was about 2018 when they ended up asking for asylum at the port of entry. This is pre-COVID, what would have happened. So they come to the port of entry. It turns out that they came to the San Diego or the Tijuana port of entry. They ask for asylum. To hear Maria tell the story, they spent about a week in what's called the hilera, the icebox. It's known that the Border Patrol detention facilities are often very cold, but she said we spent about a week in the hilera waiting, and eventually we were given what's called a credible fear interview by an asylum officer. Another group from another part of the Border Patrol comes in, somebody who's experienced at asking the right questions to see if there is a credible fear to ask for asylum. They were able to pass their credible fear test, and they were then passed along to a local shelter run by a local nonprofit in San Diego. Why? Because one of the things she had to do was to say, where am I going to live while I'm here in the country? I'm going to have to wait for my asylum hearing in the courts. Well, Maria had a sister here in Charlottesville. So she said, I'm going to live with my sister in Charlottesville. So that sister paid, sent money out to the shelter, and then she and her son took the bus all the way from San Diego here to Charlottesville, and that's where I met them. I was working for an organization, and my job was to just transport people who were waiting for asylum to do certain things. What did they need to do first? They were given papers called notice to appear. She was given a notice to appear in the court up in Alexandria. That's our local court here. So she was given the papers, and she was told, you need to be there on this day because we're going to have what's called a master calendar hearing. We're just going to bring 20 of you into a room, and we're going to bring you into the court. You're going to talk to the judge. The judge wants to be sure that you understand what the charges are. Now, the charges against her, there were no charges, but she was on a removal procedure. Her papers said, you are being removed, but if you want, you need to apply within 1 year for asylum, 1 year of your entry date. But that first meeting with the courts, and I went up with her because I drove her up to the courts, we just talked to the judge. The judge says, do you understand you're in removal proceedings? Are you looking for somebody who can help you? Are you looking for a lawyer to help you? Yes, I'm looking for a lawyer. Okay, come back in 2 months. I want to see you with a lawyer in 2 months. So that's what we did. In 2 months, we went back. In the meantime, we had gotten a lawyer for her in Richmond who charged $6,000 for her and her son to apply for asylum. This was now in about 2019. We went up for the second time. The lawyer came with us, met us at the courthouse. We went in front of by then she had then applied with, it's called a 529. She had applied for asylum. Fine. Your court hearing, the literal date when we are going to be seeing you for the final decision is in 2023. So at that time, there was a 4-year wait between when she applied and when the court had time to hear her case. Now, in the meantime, with COVID, that date has been extended, and if there had been a shutdown, that date would also be extended. So again, you've just sort of heard the general story of what happens to people if they've applied for asylum. They must get in front of a judge. This is not, I just can stand in front of a judge and cry and wail and say, I've just been put upon. No, this is a very specific, detailed, complicated proof that generally people without lawyers don't have a good chance of being successful because they don't know our laws. They don't know what to say, and they're not required to have a lawyer. Turns out what Maria didn't know but I knew, because I knew the statistics, was that she had about a 1 in 5 chance of actually seeking, of actually getting the judge's decision to give her that asylum. So she was going to live, she'll be living 4 to 5 to 6 years here in Charlottesville, waiting for her hearing, her court hearing in front of the judge, before the judge will be able to decide whether she can stay with her son or not. So that's sort of the general process. Now, what's happened with the folks in New York City is that a lot of these people now do not have the sister in Charlottesville. They do not have the fiscal sponsor who agrees to take them. The other thing we did with Maria was, after she'd applied for asylum, 6 months later, I took her up north so she could get fingerprints so that she could work. Because all these people have the right to work, but not until they've applied for asylum, and then 6 months later they apply for a work permit. So the 60,000 that are sitting in New York have no fiscal sponsor, and they probably don't have legal support, or they didn't, at least in the beginning, to say to them, you need to apply for asylum and then you need to apply for a work permit 6 months later. They don't have the fiscal sponsor that they're living with. So that's one of the problems with the whole system, is they don't have the same support systems that other people have had in the past. So, okay. We'll go on, and maybe there'll be some questions from that. What did Biden do? Okay, Title 42 goes away. Basically, Biden's theory is, I need to be harsher on my penalties when people do things that are illegal, and I need to be giving more opportunities for people, more pathways to come here legally if I can make them. So basically, he created some new pathways for people from Cuba and Nicaragua and Haiti, and he said, we're going to accept 30,000 people a month from these countries, but they must have a fiscal sponsor. We've just talked about fiscal sponsors, and you must have a passport and a flight to the US. You can apply from home, you can apply from where you are, but you have to be able to pay for yourself to come here, and you have to have a sponsor, and you can't have done anything illegal. You can't have gone through Panama, or you can't have come through Mexico. You can't basically walk to the northern part of Mexico and then apply from there. You must do this from home or some safe place. So that's one thing that he did, creating another pathway. He also set up smartphone applications for appointments. Now, this is extremely controversial. This is an app on a smartphone. Not, of course, these people don't all have smartphones. They don't all speak English. There's a lot of problems with this technology. I think that's true, and there's been a huge uproar over the use of this CBP1, but keep in mind, otherwise, the paperwork is literally paperwork. So my opinion is, like, bad idea out of the, I mean, good idea, bad execution out of the gate, but probably moving in the right direction to put something more into the computer, mechanize this, computerize this, so that we have, rather than pieces of paper floating around, we actually have an electronic record of what's happening and how we follow these people along. Again, I said the carrot and the stick. This is more of the stick. Increased use of expedited removal, just removing people right away. And then a transit ban. This is also very controversial. Saying that unless you've applied in other countries, let's say you're coming from Colombia, and in order to get from Colombia up to the southern border, you have to first go through Panama, and then up through Central America, and then you go through, El Salvador and Guatemala, and then Mexico. And what this rule says, unless you've applied for asylum in some other country en route and been denied, you cannot apply with us. Something like this was implemented during the Trump time, but it was deemed illegal. So this has been changed a little bit. But again, all these are quite controversial and being discussed in the courts as to whether they're legal or not. One last issue related to the changes at the border, and then we'll sort of morph into a little bit easier topics. I just wanted to mention some of the other things that the U.S. is doing in order to relieve the problems at the border. We spend a lot of money and time and military support in some of these other countries in order to basically move the border away from Mexico. If we could get Mexico's border with Guatemala to be stronger, not so many people would cross that border and get as far as the northern part of Mexico to come to our border. So one strategy is keep other borders strong so that people don't move north and come towards Mexico. Trying to get other countries to do more as far as creating jobs and creating places for asylum for other people. That's number 2. Accepting more refugees from Latin America. Fast tracking the asylum hearings. One of the things I always hear is, why don't we just get more judges? I think that when I first started doing these talks, there were about 700,000 cases backlogged in the immigration courts, and now there are over 2 million cases backlogged in the courts. So one of the things they're trying is to fast track some of the asylum hearings that come in sooner, so that people can come in and have their hearing quickly and then either be told they can stay or they can leave. Expanding it's this called Customs and Border Protection Facilities to hold in-process families. One of the things that we're seeing at the border is that there just isn't enough physical space to put these people. So where are they going to go? The Border Patrol was not set up to hold lots of people. And so there's a lot of controversy around what facility is available, where are they being held, are they being held overnight? Some of these are women and children. Are they being held by themselves with other people? You know, this is a big issue, a big problem. And then, of course, put more asylum officers and judges at the border. The question always remains is the fact that inadequate or no legal representation is available for these people. And we could do a speedy and an efficient process, but it may not give the asylum applicants the full legally required access to U.S. asylum processes. This is the problem that we have, right? We've got to do things legally, and what does that entail? What does that include? So Mexican cartels are supported by some of the U.S. laws. I wanted to just talk about the cartels a little bit. Mexican cartels are estimated to have revenues of about $500 billion. The biggest businesses that they're in are selling drugs and smuggling humans. Studies show that the drugs enter through the ports of entry, and they're brought through by Americans. There's some misinformation in the media that you might hear, oh, the drugs are being brought in by all these people who are crossing between the ports of entry. No, that's not true. These drugs are worth a lot of money. They're not going to let somebody carry them across between the ports of entry. They're going to bring them through the ports of entry, but remember the numbers from the very first slide, how many trucks? We get 1,000 trucks a day going through Nogales. They can't possibly unpack all those trucks to inspect them. So they're missing some of those based on just the sheer numbers. So we know that the drugs are going through the ports of entry, and that the drug runners are U.S. citizens, generally paid by the drug cartels. So the drugs come into the U.S. What happens then? The drugs are sold. How are we going to get the money back to Mexico to the cartels? There's 2 main ways. One is I can launder the money and send them through the banks, which happens quite a bit, but I can also send back arms. I can send back guns. We are always shipping guns over to Mexico to those cartels. And so in those places where there are liberal gun control or gun ownership laws, we see problems, because we know, here's a statistic, 70% of the guns that were seized in Mexico were purchased legally in the U.S. between 2014 and 2018. So our liberal gun laws about who can buy a gun, who can trade a gun with somebody else, all that, when we have liberal laws, it enhances the cartel's ability to sell drugs here. So when we're thinking about the drug problems, this is another thing we want to keep thinking about. And I know that there are programs within the U.S. and within Mexico for seizing more arms from the U.S. I know that increasingly, as we decide to go across the border from where we live and into Mexico, there are more dogs looking for arms going in there. So this is all spinning up our ability to move across the border. Just a note about the border wall. The border wall really started in about 1990, and only about a third of the whole border has a wall on it. I mean, I don't know if these numbers, I don't know what it feels like out here, what you hear in the news as far as borders. I mean, sometimes I hear we're going to have a border all the way across it's really just not practical to think about building a wall across the entire 2,000. But this is just a list. Strategically, what started to happen was that in the cities, we decided to start walls because we thought if we block off where the cities with walls, this is where most people cross without the proper papers. Eventually, we're going to get out to the desert. People will not be going around when it's so dangerous to go through the desert. They're not going to go around the wall to come in, but in fact, they do. And so we started thinking if we just built the wall in enough places, they wouldn't be able to get around it. The fact of the matter is, people do get around walls. They dig under walls, they go over walls, they cut through walls. And so I just made this list here of the different presidents and the different things that they did as far as building the wall. It's not like, oh, the Republicans build walls, but the Democrats don't. Every president has added a little bit to the walls. Here's a picture down in Arizona. It looks a lot taller than it actually is. This is the new 30-foot wall that was part of the money that President Trump put when he was in office. And this is what's called a bollard wall. These are metal strips that you can see through. That was an important thing to remember. We don't want to just build a wall we can't see through because we want to see who's on the other side. At the top, they put a metal strip thinking, well, you can't really climb over the wall because you can't get traction if you put this little strip up at the top. It just doesn't stop them. They are building ladders that they can hook over the top, and then they just climb up the ladder. They bring solder and irons, and they just cut through the metal at the bottom, and they crawl through. There's just really, it's not effective to keep people. And then eventually, this is another view. This is also in the desert near where we are. Eventually, you get down to just something like this that blocks a car, but of course isn't going to stop a person. So I just wanted to show you that. And then we're going to open it up to questions in a minute. I just wanted to mention a few things, though, in case you want to learn more. This is the one page, if you want to take a picture, this might be the one that you would take it of. These are some of the resources that I use. I wanted to mention that in the Virginia Film Festival is going to be showing somewhere, somehow, and I don't know, Russ, if you have more information. It's about made by someone locally, and it's, I think, about the local situation here. Did you want to?
Briefly, it's going to be at the Culbra Theater, UVA Culbra Theater. It's many of the folks are speaking Spanish, and it's got English subtitles and vice versa. I've only seen a trailer. It looks really powerful. These are local Latinos who came, and what's their story about coming, and why did they come?
Thanks for that. But these are some of the resources that I used, not only to get the statistics for today, but just these are the newsletters that I receive. I mean, I probably spend about 20 hours a week reading about what's going on at the border and in immigration just to stay current. But there are some very good daily updates from the National Immigration Forum. The Migration Policy Institute is a very well-regarded international organization with an office in Washington. Syracuse University has some very interesting statistics. They take all the government statistics and analyze them related to the courts, related to the detention centers. We haven't had a chance to talk about detention centers yet today. The Cato Institute is interesting. I just have recently started following them. They have some interesting things to say about employment and immigration. When I looked at the labor statistics at the end of last year, it said there were 11 million open jobs in the U.S. That's come down considerably. I think the last I read was more closer, something to like 9 million jobs opening. And so it seems to me our labor law, our laws have just not allowed us to connect that we have this need for labor with these people who maybe want jobs. You know, we haven't made it smooth or easy. And so there's maybe some opportunity there. But the Cato Institute has what they call a green card game. You can go there, or maybe if you have a group that wants to learn more, you can take the green card game and it will help you decide. You're living overseas, you can pick a persona that I'm so and so, I'm so old and I've got this age and I do this job and I want to have a green card. I want to go to the US. And what you find out really is how hard it is to come here if you're living overseas. So that's an interesting exercise. I also wanted to mention, if you have any interest in volunteering locally, we have in the back of the room Katie Hero, who's with the IRC, and she can talk to you about refugee resettlement. She also has some sheets if you haven't had a chance to pick those up. Also in the back is Heather Tannenhoff, Tebenhoff, with literacy volunteers. So they teach English to people from all countries here in Charlottesville, and so she'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. And then there's a group here that's not represented, but Seville Tulips works with the Afghan women here in town, so they're in need of volunteers. So there's lots of ways to help out and do some fun, interesting things, but I'm going to stop talking, and I think we're going to have some questions to keep going here.
Yeah, so I think, Alyson, you're most interested in hearing from the audience and the audience questions. So what we'd love to do is just get you start raising your hand. I'll just kick us off to like break the ice and ask, you talked a lot about the different policies and the way that they affect the migrant populations, but how are they hearing about these policies and then communicating with each other about these policies, and how is it affecting their decision to migrate?
Great. That's a great question. Sadly, the migrants are not getting perfect information about what's going on. And we know from talking to people, say, in the shelters in northern Mexico, they really don't have a clue what the policies are that are going to affect them when they approach the border, either at the port of entry or if they're going to cross. So, and sadly, we sometimes don't even know ourselves what to suggest that they do, because on any given day it might be it might change. They might there might be a policy, for example, that they would be accepting asylum seekers, but there might be no room on the other side to hold the asylum seekers. At one point, one of the folks just showed up from the port of entry and said, if you're a male and you're taking in for asylum today, you're going to be in detention for another month. So choose wisely. So just know there's no room at the inn here. So you saw the poster from Guatemala. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of information that's shared on social media. It's a lot more credible to the migrants than it would be if you stood up and you actually informed them of the policy or what was happening. And I think it was Kamala Harris who went down to, I think, Guatemala or Mexico, and she said, don't come. Remember that speech where she said, if you're thinking about coming, don't come. I seriously doubt any migrant that was thinking about going north even heard the speech, let alone would think that that was the truth. So there's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of information on social media, like hearing in the news about the open borders. That's what people are telling us. I heard on the news that you had open borders. I thought I could just walk right in. We really don't have open borders.
Great. So I think there's a question back there for Rusty.
Use the mic because we're recording this. Thank you.
Um, what concerns me most in this country is the narrative that we've been fed for the last several years, really since Trump. And I find it absolutely astounding when you showed that last thing about the cartels, that the people who talk about open borders and seem to be so against immigration are the same people who who are for the lax gun laws and are actually supporting the cartels that they complain about all the time. And I wonder, as someone who's dealt with this, how can we change the narrative? Are we too far gone, or is there good solutions that are available to us? And the other thing is the fentanyl issue. We hear how all this fentanyl is coming in from the southern border, 43%, 55%. What's the reality? I mean, what's actually the reality of what's coming in at the southern border? I believe certainly your presentation about it's not coming in on the backs of the migrants who are trying to come across with just the clothes on their backs. But I wonder what actually is the reality of what's coming in.
Okay, I have two questions. I'll start with the fentanyl first. I'm not really an expert on fentanyl or drugs. If you really want to know, you could Google any of these topics. I mean, anything you've heard me say, most of it came from the internet somewhere, and I looked for multiple sources. It's my understanding that the fentanyl is coming across the ports of entry, and I saw a map recently that basically showed a lot of it is coming through Nogales. I'm sorry to say. So I think it's true. I think it is. Now I don't know what the 45 and 55. I don't know what those numbers mean, but I think there's a lot coming across, and I think it's coming. I mean, my understanding is this is synthetic. The parts are coming from China. They're being assembled, and then they're coming through the ports. Yeah. Okay. The second question, the narrative. The more that I do with this work, and the more that I think about this topic, the more I think how important the narrative is. But the narrative is so affected by social media. One of the things that's just happened in the last few days is that Elon Musk has gone to the border. And so he's tweeted from the border, and it's just mind-boggling what is being said and what's being tweeted out to the whole world. And of course, everybody knows how smart Elon Musk is, so it must be right what I'm hearing. But I heard several things that were not true that I just knew right off the bat that were being said, and it just wasn't true. But this is what people listen to. So I don't have an answer to the narrative question. I'd love to have one, because I think the narrative is getting us in trouble. Mm-hmm.
Alyson, I'm wondering, where is legal education factoring in, and do we have young lawyers who are being trained on these issues?
I will hand that right over to Amanda, who teaches lawyers.
Yeah, so there's an enormous need for lawyers to represent these people. As Alyson's slide suggested, like there's very few representatives, legal representatives for these people, which is very difficult, right? It's hard enough, it's so complex, and then if you don't speak English and you don't have much of an education to navigate this, or you're a child, or in other ways handicapped, it's very difficult for somebody to represent themselves. So the answer is, there's an immigration clinic at a lot of law schools, including at the UVA Law School, and clinics do a lot of important legal work, and there's specialized clinics that deal with Afghan refugees. I've been working with students and Afghan refugees, and not only do we do legal work ourselves, but we can reach out to experts at law school clinics all over the country for assistance, and it's a terrific supportive network. There's also something called the Immigrant Justice Corps that started in New York, and a Second Circuit judge started it because he was so appalled at the problematic cases he was seeing appealed from the immigration courts, and it was bogging down his court, which has to do a lot of things, right? Federal courts do a lot more than immigration. And so he said the whole system will work better if we get lawyers to these people, and that's developed in New York, and now it's spreading to other places with funding for pro bono lawyers who graduate from law school into these 2 or 3 year fellowships where they represent non-citizens in removal proceedings. And so, and immigration is, I think like 20 years ago, it wasn't a subject that every law school taught, and now law schools are teaching immigration. So I would say that there's some of the need being filled, but the need is enormous, and so not enough. And last thing to say, you don't need to be a lawyer to represent someone in an immigration court. You can be an accredited representative and go through a process, and that's because of the great need and because people can do an excellent job without that legal training as long as they have appropriate preparation for it. So if that's something of interest, look into that because it's another way to get more people representation.
Does your law school support this certification? No. No, right?
Well, because we're training lawyers, we don't need to train the accredited representatives, but there are programs of the Department of Justice that do this, or you can get referrals. You can look on their website. They are the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which is in the Department of Justice, which handles the immigration courts, has put in place a program to enable people to have lawyers. Because guess who always has a lawyer? The government, right? So they want to at least get either lawyers or accredited representatives, people that are skilled enough in immigration law to show up in immigration court and assist these people. So if you're interested in that, you can look and see at the accreditation process. UVA Law School doesn't do that because we're graduating lawyers, but it's a great place to go if you're interested in non-JD assistance to refugees or immigrants.
Yeah, good, thanks. I think Peggy had her.
Thanks, Alyson. It was a great talk. If you were president, and I wish you were, what what would you do? What would be your first steps to solve the immigration problem? Knowing that what you know now, what are the first, most important steps to kind of?
I have to say, the last time I gave this talk, somebody asked if I were king, what would I do? But I guess president would be okay. I'm glad, I'm glad you asked because, of course, this is what plagues me. Okay, so it's kind of a mess. What would I do? Because my background is in the private sector, I tend to see the whole economic problem. I'm not an economist, but I have read that historically, the influx of immigrants at 1 million a year, that was our typical rate, that supported 2% of our GDP per year. That supported big growth in our country. So I see how important these people are to the growth of our country. I also see when you think about other countries, you read about Europe, right? We're not replacing our population with our birth rate. This is a problem that's going to start to snowball. Europe has the problem, Japan, Korea, some of these other countries. We are soon going to be competing for these people. We're not now, but already I've been on these calls and I've heard the Australians, the Europeans, and the Canadians who are all starting to turn their heads into better, more productive programs to attract labor because they know they need them. And in fact, Canada is starting to actually take some of the labor that we have here because we've not handled some of our visas properly for the people who are here. So I tend to move towards, okay, we have asylum seekers at the southern border. They don't have another choice. But really, if we gave them work, would they take it? Yes, I think a lot of these people would take work. One of my ideas was let's put something at the southern border that would allow us to communicate with the states that needed labor and get the labor there. I was on a Migration Policy Institute lecture today online, and what this one gentleman said, and I thought the idea was great. Like the refugees, and you brought this solution up when you said, why don't we have the same system for the asylum seekers that we have for refugees? That being, we're going to all come together, we're going to decide we're going to do this as a country, we're going to support these people, and we're going to work together to decide who's going to take these people. I mean, everything you read says almost every state in the union needs workers. There are some places that say, we'll take the refugees, but there's no mechanism to do it. There have been proposals by some of the senators to put more of a resource center down by the border so we could do all this. The fact that the system says you can apply for asylum and that's your only choice is a little bit, it doesn't make sense to me, right? But if somebody could look at that person and say, tell us about your circumstance. Are you really seeking asylum? Are you really afraid of persecution? Are you really having trouble here? Or are you looking for work? We're not going to make you a citizen. I'm not a big believer in making a whole bunch of new citizens because I don't think that's should be part of the solution. But I'd love to see a lot more temporary visas so that we can bring more people in to do the work that we all know we need. So that's part of the solution I'd recommend.
You heard it here first.
Ah.
We'll get you a campaign manager.
Oh.
Other questions? Yes.
Well, you mentioned that you thought a lot of Americans were bringing the drugs across the border. I can't believe that the cartels are not coming across the border and organizing in this country.
No, I don't think they're coming.
You know?
Mm-mm. I think they have contacts over here.
Yeah, oh, well.
Yeah. And they could have some people who are here without the proper papers, but I don't think they're the ones actually bringing the drugs across. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to make a statement more than ask a question. But you had said that the laws that we're working with were drafted in 1965.
Right.
Don't you think it's about time our politicians got together and worked on this to solve the situation?
I sure do. I sure do. They just can't seem to come together on this issue. And they haven't for quite a while, sadly.
Other questions?
Over here on the right.
You mentioned that you would address children and families in the situation.
Yes, thank you. Increasingly, the children at the border is a big issue because, as you remember from that one slide, back in the 90s, we didn't see a lot of children coming north. And now the situation is getting bad for some of these families, and they're coming north, either the children by themselves. I think I read 240 children. I'm going to have to think about my quote before I give you the statistic. Anyway, more children than you can imagine are still coming across unaccompanied. This is without an adult. Sometimes the families in northern Mexico send their children across because it's so dangerous where they're living, if they're living in a shelter or they're living on the street or they're living in a tent city in northern Mexico waiting for the laws to change. They might say, this is too dangerous. I'll send my 8-year-old child across by themselves and I'll take my chances they can get to Chicago. They're handled differently than a male would, that's for sure. But the psychological damage is huge. There were about 5,000 children separated under the Trump administration. And I just read that the head of DHS and Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, were actually called into court the other day to testify because they were the ones that decided on this policy, which is quite draconian and really was, for the first time, brought out all kinds of people to fight against separating children. Because those children, if they can match up the parent with the child, generally the child has stayed in the States and the parents have been deported. So the parent is back, let's say, in Guatemala. The child is somewhere living in California. And the choice that the parent then has to make, if they can find them, is do you want your child to come home and live in your world, which is why you left in the first place, or do you want to go live in the States? But in the meantime, what happens psychologically to the children is that they have been ruined. These children do not understand why the parent didn't protect them. Even if they had the best of intentions, the child does not understand why the parent didn't protect them from this situation, either being in detention for long periods of time, even if it's an HHS living facility, or if they go on to foster homes, that kind of thing. This can be very bad for the children. So it's a very serious issue that we who espouse family orientation need to keep in mind as we're thinking about our laws and our regulations. Any other questions? I'm going to stop. Please remember that Katie and Heather are back in the back of the room if you want to learn more about teaching English or IRC resettlement. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you've had a chance to learn a little bit more about immigration and the border.